Have you ever wondered what happens when a man who has everything, the corner office, the charitable donations, the neighbors who wave at him from their driveways, turns into something unrecognizable the moment the front door closes? Have you ever watched someone smile through a bruise they covered with concealer and thought, how does she do it? Have you ever asked yourself what it takes to break a person? And what it takes for that same person to rebuild themselves into something their abuser never saw coming? This is the story of Lorraine Osei, and by the time it ends, you will understand exactly how far a woman can bend before she decides she will never break again. Lorraine was 26 when she married Fletcher Bowen in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was October, and the maples were burning orange and gold, and everyone who attended said it was the most beautiful wedding they had ever seen. Fletcher stood at the end of the aisle in a charcoal suit with his jaw set and his eyes soft, and Lorraine walked toward him in her grandmother's pearls, thinking she had found the safest place in the world. She was a kindergarten teacher in Hamilton. She had a laugh that filled rooms. She called her mother every Sunday and kept a small herb garden on her apartment windowsill. And when she moved into Fletcher's house in Ancaster, she brought the herbs with her. The basil, the thyme, the rosemary she had grown from seed, and lined them up on the kitchen windowsill like she was planting a flag. Fletcher was a civil engineer. He had a good reputation in the city, sat on 2 charity boards, coached minor hockey on Saturday mornings. At neighborhood barbecues he was the one who stayed late to help fold up chairs. People liked Fletcher Bowen enormously. They told Lorraine she was lucky. She believed them, for a while. The first time he hit her, they had been married 7 months. It was a Tuesday in May and she had forgotten to pick up dry cleaning. That was all. She had stayed late at school to help a student who was struggling to hold a pencil. And she had driven straight home, and she had walked through the door and said, "I'm sorry, I completely forgot. I'll go tomorrow first thing." And before she finished the sentence, the back of his hand caught her across the cheek. The sound was very sharp in that quiet house. Lorraine stood there with her school bag still over her shoulder, her hand raised to her face, and she looked at Fletcher and he looked at her, and for one long second neither of them moved. Then his face shifted. He pulled her into his arms. He said he was under so much pressure at work. He said he didn't know what had come over him. He wept into her hair, and she stood in his arms and felt the warmth of him and told herself that this was a one-time thing, that this was not who he was, that marriages went through hard seasons. It was not a one-time thing. Over the following months, Lorraine learned the architecture of Fletcher's anger. She learned that it built slowly on days when a work project stalled. She learned that it quickened when she laughed too long with someone else at a dinner party, or when supper was on the table at 6:15 instead of 6 lat, or when she came to bed wearing the old university sweatshirt he didn't like. She learned to move quietly through the house. She learned to read the air. She stopped calling her mother every Sunday. She stopped going to Friday drinks with the other teachers. She told herself she was simplifying her life. She told herself a lot of things. Fletcher had a rule about her phone. He checked it on Thursday evenings, scrolling through her messages with the same focused expression he wore when reviewing engineering schematics. He had a rule about her clothing. He had a rule about who she could drive to school with in the winter, which was no one. She drove alone. He had a rule about grocery shopping, which she did between 4 and 5:30, returning home with the receipt so he could verify the time on the credit card statement. To the outside world, Fletcher Bowen remained exactly what he had always been: charitable, reliable, the kind of man you called when you needed help moving a couch or someone to sit with you at a hospital. Lorraine wore long sleeves through that first summer. She told her colleague Bridget that she had eczema. What Fletcher did not know, what he had no reason to suspect because he believed he had made her very small and very afraid, was that Lorraine had a sister named Pauline. Pauline was 32, a paralegal in Toronto, sharp and patient in the way that people who have spent years watching other people's disasters tend to become. Pauline had noticed things before Lorraine was ready to admit them. She had noticed the way Lorraine hesitated before answering questions. She had noticed the cardigan in July. She had noticed that her sister, who had once been the loudest person at any table, now flinched when someone raised their voice. Pauline did not push, she waited. The day Lorraine finally called her, it was 2:14 in the morning, and she was sitting in the school parking lot because she had no memory of driving there. She had a split lip. She did not know what to say, so she said, "I think I need help." Pauline said, "I know. I've been waiting for you." They did not call the police that night. Pauline explained why, and she explained it carefully. The way she explained things to clients who did not yet understand that the law moved slowly, And that documentation was a kind of armor. She said that without evidence, Fletcher would walk out of any station with a handshake and a coffee and return home angrier than he had left. She said that what Lorraine needed was a record. So Lorraine started building one. She was careful about it the way she was careful about everything now. She kept a journal on a notes app buried inside a folder on her phone that appeared, on the surface, to be a recipe file. She photographed bruises in the school bathroom, the timestamps preserved. She noted dates, times, what had been said. She emailed the photos to a secure address Pauline had set up, from the school's Wi-Fi, never from home. She got better at looking like she wasn't doing anything at all. There were months when she nearly stopped. There were months when Fletcher was gentle and almost recognizable. And she would lie awake beside him, thinking that perhaps she had gotten this wrong. That perhaps the good version of him was the real one. And the other was an aberration. There were months when the idea of leaving felt more frightening than the idea of staying, because leaving meant court dates and lawyers and a city that knew his name, and staying just meant getting through another week. Pauline talked her through those months. Pauline kept the file growing. 2 years into the documentation. 3.5 years into the marriage. Lorraine found out she was pregnant. She sat in the bathroom of a Shoppers Drug Mart on Upper James Street and stared at the test and thought about what kind of world she would be bringing a child into. She thought about what it would mean for a child to grow up in that house. She thought about what Fletcher would say when she told him, and whether that would be a moment of softness or a moment of danger. It was not a moment of softness. He came home that evening already tight, with something that had happened at work, and she told him carefully, standing near the counter so there was distance between them, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Is it mine?" The question was delivered without raising his voice. That was somehow the worst part. After that night, something shifted in Lorraine. It wasn't courage exactly. It was more like the place inside her that had been afraid simply ran out of room. She called Pauline the next morning and said, "I think we need to move faster." Pauline said, "Then we move faster." They had enough. They had photographs and dates and a pattern so consistent it was almost clinical. They had witnesses Lorraine had never named to Fletcher. Her colleague Bridget, who had seen the bruise on a day the cardigan slipped. A neighbor named Mrs. Tremblay, who had heard things through the wall of the garage and who, it turned out, had been quietly worried for 2 years, and was willing to say so. They had a record of financial control detailed enough to constitute its own offense. What they needed now was a plan for the day Lorraine walked out, because Fletcher was not the kind of man who would accept walking out. He was the kind of man who would make phone calls. He was the kind of man who, Lorraine knew in her bones, would show up at the school. Pauline had thought about this. Pauline had thought about almost everything. On a Thursday in November, the same Thursday Fletcher always checked her phone, Lorraine sat across the kitchen table from him and watched him scroll through her messages the way he always did, unhurried, proprietary, and she kept her breathing steady because the phone he was holding contained nothing he had not already seen. The recipe file was not on this phone. This phone was clean. The next morning, Lorraine went to school. She did not come home. She had arranged it with Pauline over months, in pieces, the way you plan something when every conversation is surveilled. A bag at Pauline's apartment in Toronto, her important documents, birth certificate, SIM card, passport, the boys and girls who knew what Fletcher had done, scanned and stored and carried nowhere near the house. Her paychecks had been routed, for the past 8 months, to an account Fletcher did not know existed. She left nothing behind that she could not live without. Fletcher came home to an empty house at 6:17 p.m. He found supper not on the table, herbs gone from the windowsill, a kitchen that looked exactly as it always had except for the fact that his wife was not in it and was not going to be. He called her phone. She did not answer. He called it 37 more times before midnight. He called the school on Friday morning and was told that Lorraine had requested emergency family leave, and that the administration was not in a position to share further information. He called her mother and was told, politely and without elaboration, that her mother had not spoken to her. He drove to Pauline's apartment building in Toronto and stood in the lobby for 40 minutes until the building manager asked him to leave. He was very good at appearing reasonable when there were witnesses. That had always been true. On the Monday of the following week, Lorraine sat in a meeting room in a law office on Bay Street with Pauline beside her, and a lawyer named Ms. Garreau across the table, and she opened a folder and began to explain what the past 3.5 years had looked like. Ms. Garreau listened without interrupting. At the end she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "This is thorough." Lorraine said, "I had time to be thorough." The case moved through the courts in the way that serious cases do when the documentation is airtight. And the witnesses are steady, and the accused has spent years being so publicly reasonable that the contrast, when the evidence surfaces, is almost incomprehensible. Fletcher's lawyer was expensive. Fletcher sat in court in a well-cut suit and answered questions with the measured tone of a man who coached minor hockey and sat on charity boards. He was very convincing. The photographs were more convincing. The witnesses were more convincing still. Bridget testified quietly and without drama. Mrs. Tremblay was 81 years old and had a clarity of memory that the defense did not successfully challenge. The financial records were presented by Pauline's firm in a document so complete that it took the Crown attorney 45 minutes to walk through it. Fletcher's former business partner, a man named Gary who had spent 3 years pretending not to notice things, finally noticed them. He gave a statement. His wife gave one too. The verdict came down on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 15 months after Lorraine had walked out of that house in Ancaster for the last time. Fletcher Bowen was found guilty on 3 counts of assault, causing bodily harm, and 1 count of criminal harassment. He was sentenced to 4 years in a federal facility, with a 10-year no-contact order attached. His engineering license was referred to the regulatory body for review. The charity boards asked for his resignation the same week the verdict was published. Lorraine was in the courthouse when the sentence was read. She sat very still and kept her hands in her lap, and looked straight ahead. Beside her, Pauline reached over and held her hand, and neither of them said anything. There is something people don't tell you about the end of something like this. They don't tell you that justice, when it comes, feels quieter than you expected. That you don't feel triumphant the way you imagined you would. That you mostly feel tired, and then relieved, and then something else that takes a while to name. Lorraine took a month off work. She went to her mother's house in Sudbury and slept for 12 hours a night, and let her mother feed her, and did not explain anything more than she already had. Her daughter, Nadia, born 5 months before the trial began, healthy and loud and sleeping through the night by 10 weeks, which felt like a small mercy from the universe, slept in the bedroom across the hall, and woke up early and reached for things with both hands the way babies do, unafraid of anything, not yet knowing there was anything to be afraid of. Lorraine watched her daughter reach for things and thought, "That's what I'm doing. That's exactly what I'm doing." She went back to her kindergarten classroom in September. Her students brought her drawings on the first day, the way they always did, the way they had every year she had taught. Crooked suns and lopsided houses and families rendered in whatever crayon first came to hand. She taped them to the wall above the cubbies. She watered the small pot of basil on the windowsill. She had started a new one, from seed again, and she stood in the middle of her classroom in the September light, and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten what to call it. She felt like herself. Fletcher served 3 years of his sentence. Lorraine did not track the details. What she tracked instead was the foundation she and Pauline had quietly established in the year after the trial. A small, practical organization that helped women in Hamilton and the surrounding area navigate the legal and financial logistics of leaving. Not a hotline, not a shelter, but a resource for the paperwork. How to open an account, how to document, how to understand what evidence would and wouldn't hold up, how to plan for the day you walked out so that when you did not walk out with nothing. She named it the Rosemary Project, after the herb, after something that grows back. There are women in Hamilton who found Lorraine's foundation in the weeks after they left. There are women who sat in its office on a Tuesday morning, with their hands in their laps, and heard someone explain, calmly and practically, that they had options. That the law moved slowly but it moved. That documentation was a kind of armor. That the plan could be built in pieces, over time, quietly, while the world believed everything was fine. Fletcher Bowen did not break Lorraine Osei. He tried. He had 4 years to try, and a house in Ancaster, and a reputation that the whole city seemed to want to protect. What he did not account for was her sister, and her patience, and the herbs on the windowsill, and the daughter who reached for things with both hands. What he did not account for was how long a quiet woman can plan when she has decided she is going to survive.